And good morning and welcome. My name is Stuart. I'm one of the leaders here at River, and it's so good to see all of you. And for those joining us online, welcome as well. It's good to be with you. To our college students, it's good to see you guys. Welcome back to Norman. We've missed you guys. One request, if you're driving west of campus on an evening somewhere between Lindsay and Boyd, just keep it within the speed limit. That's when my family goes walking and where they go walking. But we're glad you guys are back. We hope you stick around for lunch. I look forward to getting to know you while you're here in Norman. I would encourage you, though, I think back to my time in school. I went to OU. And one of the things that God did in my life was not just draw me close in a personal sense as I began to really see what it meant to walk with Jesus, but along with that, he began connecting me to a local church, and I began to see more and more and more how we were designed and meant to live in community with our brothers and sisters in Jesus. And so I would encourage you, whether it's River or another one of the great churches here in Norman, get connected, because it will be one of the primary vehicles I believe that God will use in your life to shape and form you and prepare you for what's next. All right? Well, this morning we're going to continue a series that we've been working through for several months now, and it's loosely titled The Story. And essentially it's just a walk through the life of Jesus as told by Mark. We've just been preaching through the Gospel of Mark. And this morning, we're going to talk about what I've titled, and this is a little wordy, but it'll hopefully make sense by the end, but we're going to talk about how a tricky question leads to a deeper understanding of discipleship. How a tricky question leads to a deeper understanding of discipleship. So as we get started, I'm just going to read our passage, then we'll pray, and then we'll dive in, okay? So if you have your Bible or your phone app, go ahead and open to Mark 10. We're going to be in verses 1 through 12. I think I also have it up here on the screen, so if you don't have your Bible, no pressure, no worries. Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 1, reading through verse 12. And he's referring to Jesus here. And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. And crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up in order to test him. And they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And he answered them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined, let not man separate. And in the house," so later after this sequence, "in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Now, you might think back to the title of our message this morning, and you say, well, I thought you said we're going to talk about discipleship. I thought you were going to talk about what it means to follow Jesus. I don't get that from what you just read. Well, I'll explain how I got a focus of discipleship out of this passage in just a minute. But let's start here. Let's start with the big idea. If we lose the feed, or if there's an emergency that was to arise, and all of a sudden I wasn't up here anymore, what do I want you guys to walk away with? What do I want you to hold with you when you leave? It's this. The heart of discipleship, what Jesus wants in his followers, is a willingness to walk in God's way as he designed, not as we desire. The heart of discipleship is to walk in God's way as he designed, not as we desire. So we're going to go back through this story. I'll explain where I got that out of this passage. As we do, we're going to run into a very uncomfortable reality. It's true for all of us. And we're going to wrap up with two truths that are also true for all of us. So, to get our bearings, where are we in the story and the life of Jesus? Well, he is on his way to Jerusalem. He spent the majority of his ministry and his adult life, basically from the age of 30 beyond, in northern Israel, in the region of Galilee. A lot of that time has been spent in a region around a place called Capernaum. I think I have it up on the map. You can see the star. I don't know, the resolution on the screenshot wasn't all that great. I apologize. But you can see the star up by the Sea of Galilee. He and his disciples have started to make the traveling, the journey down to Jerusalem in southern Israel. And they're doing this because ultimately he's going to be crucified. He knows what lies before him. And so they've been meandering through Galilee and then Samaria. Now they're in Judea, and they've crossed over the Jordan River into a region called Perea. And that's important, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So they're in Perea, and we see a shift in his ministry. He knows that he is heading to the cross. He knows he doesn't have much time left, so there's been a transition, and he's moved away from a lot of the large group ministry that he's been doing in the past. So think the feeding of the 5,000 or 4,000 or Sermon on the Mount, okay? Big, large crowds. He's moved away from that, and he's begun to focus intently on those few followers who are going to carry his message and mission forward once he's gone. So with the time remaining, he's focusing on these individuals. You look back in the previous chapter in Mark 9, verse 30, it says, when he went from there, so this is the beginning of the journey, when they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples. So he's focused intently on these guys. But he's still a national celebrity at this time, and crowds still gather. So in 10:1, it says, then he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, that's now Perea, and the crowds gathered to him just like they used to. He can't get away from it, okay? And when they do, they also attract this group of religious scholars, the holy men of the day. The Pharisees is what we often refer to them as. At this time, they viewed Jesus as a real threat to their authority. Here's this guy who wasn't brought up in their training. He doesn't really hold fastly to their view of the law or other moral issues of the day. He doesn't align with them on most things. But the crowds and the people favor him because he speaks with authority. There's something that comes out of his life that transforms people, and that threatens this group of Pharisees, these religious scholars. So they've undertaken this attempt or strategy to undercut this influence, and they'll come up with what they feel are very difficult questions to answer. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to cut his influence out from underneath him. And if they can catch him, if they can find something that's, the people won't favor this, then maybe they have an opening to go in and begin just breaking a wedge in the influence that he holds. Does that make sense? So they come, in our story this morning, they come up and they ask this question, this tricky question. They're trying to catch him, right? And they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Or in the parallel passage over in Matthew 19, I like the way that Matthew words it a little bit better because it gets to the intent of what they're driving at with this question. And Matthew says, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That term, any cause, is key. Now, why are they asking this? There's Hebrew law was complex, it was dense, and a lot of it was their doing. They had added on to what Moses had originally written. And there was a lot there. Why would they ask this question? Well, before we get there, let me quickly recap the elements of law. I went to law school, and so these interactions between these legal scholars and Jesus always kind of fascinate me because there's always this subtextual element to it. So for us to understand what's going on, let's understand three key elements of any rule, any law, okay? This is universal. One, there has to be authority. If there's no authority, then there's no basis for the law. In this story, they're saying, well, Moses was the lawgiver, thus that is the authority on which this law is based, okay? Then there has to be a rule or a requirement. I'll show that to you in just a minute. And then third, there has to be an enforcement mechanism, or sometimes we refer to it as a procedural element. How do you actually affect the rule? Okay, does that make sense? So three elements. We have our authority, we have our rule or requirement, and then we have our procedural element. Now, what are they asking? Where's they deriving this question from? Well, we find that back in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. As I mentioned just a minute ago, this is something that Moses, the great lawgiver of Israel, had passed down to the nation of Israel. And there Moses had said, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her away from his home. And then he goes on and says, basically, this will affect a divorce, a break of the union of that marriage. Do you see the three elements there? First, authority. This is from Moses. Secondly, what's the rule or requirement? What has to be broken? In this passage, the key word is some indecency. Okay, some indecency. And then there's the procedural or enforcement mechanism. Here it says the husband has to write out a certificate, place it in her hand, and send her away. If you have all of those things in order, then you can effect a divorce. So they come to Jesus and they ask this question. But they're not really asking that question. They're really not asking, is divorce lawful? What they're asking is, there was an interpretational issue within the scholarship of the day. There was a break in thought between two primary schools on, well, for what reason could you have a divorce? And it goes back to these words, some indecency. There were two primary schools of thought. One opinion was that some indecency required some moral transgression, essentially adultery. And without that moral transgression, there could be no divorce because the rule or requirement had not been breached. Okay? There was another school of thought led up by a man named Hillel, and he believed and taught that some indecency meant anything. If the husband was dissatisfied with the wife's cooking, some indecency had been committed, and he could move to divorce. If he didn't like what she said on Instagram, he could move to annul that marriage and have a divorce. Okay? So do you see the separation between the two schools of thought? So when they come and they say, Jesus, what are your thoughts on divorce? For what cause can a man separate from his wife? What they're trying to do is they're trying to catch him between these two opinions in Hebrew law. Now, why would they use this question? Like I said, they're trying to be sneaky. They're trying to catch him. They're trying to take his legs out from under him, cut up his influence. They think this plan is going to work for two reasons. One, if he picks the more liberal view, well, any indecency, or some indecency means any indecency. If they pick the broad interpretation, their argument is going to be, well, that's what the people want to hear. They want a way out of this relationship, this marriage relationship, when it gets hard. And so you're just pandering to the people, Jesus. You're just saying what they want to hear. Or if he takes the more conservative view, if he says, well, adultery is what's required for a marriage to be broken, they're playing a political game. Remember I said that they were in the region of Perea. Perea is ruled at this time by a man named Herod Antipas. If you've read the story of Mark or know the story of Jesus, Herod is a key figure because he is the man who beheaded John the Baptist. Do you remember why he beheaded John the Baptist? Why he put him to death? Herod was married. His brother Philip was married. His wife's name was Herodias. Both brothers divorced their first wives, and then Herod married his brother's ex-wife, Herodias. Holidays were probably awkward in that household. So now we have Herod married to his brother's ex-wife. We don't know the reason these two divorces occurred in the first place, but what John the Baptist did is he confronted this ruler and said, "You are not in step with God's law." And Herodias took offense to this, and she made it her personal mission to do away with John. So back in Mark 6, we see that story. So what the Pharisees are hoping is they're baiting Jesus. If he takes the easy way out and go with the popular liberal interpretation, well, Jesus, you're just pandering to the people. If he takes the more conservative view, he runs the risk of following John the Baptist, and possibly running afoul of the ruling family of that region. Either way, the Pharisees win. So do you see the trap? You see what they've done? So what happens? What's next in the story? Well, Jesus clarifies. And then, in response, the Pharisees are going to give a very revealing answer. Let's read on. Mark 10, verse 3. And he, being Jesus, answered them, "Well, what did Moses command you?" What did Moses say? What is the law? And they said, "Well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." Now, we said earlier the Pharisees are trying to be sneaky. There's a crowd gathered. They're all watching. This would have been essentially on the same level for these people as like a Law and Order type show, right? What's going to happen next? And their answer, the Pharisees' answer, is very revealing here. Because instead of answering Jesus' question about, well, what does the law say? They don't say anything about this scholarly debate. They don't touch on the issue of what does indecency mean? What is the requirement for divorce? Instead, they answer with the procedural elements of the rule. And they merely say, well, if we write a certificate of divorce and put it in her hand, that effectuates the divorce. Now, why is this revealing? Well, first of all, the crowd would have seen it and they would have said, bait and switch. They're asking him about one thing, and when he's seeking to clarify, they're giving him a different answer. They're not being genuine. They're being dishonest in their approach. But beyond that, it also reveals the nature of their heart. How did they approach God's law? And this is really what I want to focus on, because I think what we see in their hearts can be true of our hearts as well. Jesus is revealing what is going on in the hearts of these men. He's pointing out that rather than revering the law in its true intent as God designed it, they bend his law and they use it for their own devices, what they want. Rather than asking, well, what does the law call for? What is God's standard? What is his will? What is he asking you to do? What is he leading you to do? They are asking the question, well, what does this allow me to do? What can I get out of this? Rather than looking to the responsibilities that God would call them to, they're looking at their rights. One scholar put it this way, and I like his view. These men, in this answer, it reveals that they're totally missing the heart of God's instruction. In a couple chapters, Jesus would be asked, well, what is the most important law? It's another gotcha question from a Pharisee. And he answers, well, the most important law is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind and strength. You guys are familiar with that. And what's the second one? That you would love your neighbor as yourself. That is the heart. That is the whole commandment summarized. Do you see that in the Pharisees' response here? No, not at all. There's no mention or discussion around, well, if I divorce my wife, who's going to watch out for her? Who's going to protect her? Who's going to provide for her? If there's children in that home, what happens to them? There's not any focus on the true intent. Instead, they're merely jumping the procedural elements and saying, well, this is what we're allowed to do, so we're good. We're clean. Now, it would be easy for us to pile on to these men. It would be easy for us to say, man, they missed it. But River, if we are honest with ourselves, do we not find ourselves doing similar things? I know I do. Rather than truly seeking how I can serve others, I find myself doing enough to appear like I'm helping, but not really loving them the way that I should love them. Rather than being honest about the condition of my own heart before Jesus, a lot of times I hide behind kind words or good deeds. Well, I did this, so I'm good for the day. Rather than loving others as He has loved us, which means to lay down your life, I merely go so far that I treat others the way I want them to treat me in response, right? A tit for tat. I do not live up to the standard that Jesus called us to. So before we go piling on to these men, these Pharisees, let's be honest about the condition of our own hearts. This is that first reality, that reality that I mentioned earlier. It can be uncomfortable, but we must come to grips with it. And that is, apart from Jesus, my desires fall short of God's design. I, on my own, cannot, will not live out what God designed life to be, because I am focused on this guy and not him. So the crowd would have been on their seats. They would have seen what Jesus has just done. And then he makes it crystal clear in the next verse, verse 5. He says, because of your hardness of heart, he, being Moses, wrote you this commandment. Because you are hard of heart. This would have been a severe rebuke. It's only used twice in the Bible. It means there's a lack of spiritual perception in your life. You don't understand. You don't get it. The other time it's used is actually by Jesus. After his resurrection, he's speaking to his disciples. He's risen from the dead. There have been eyewitness accounts. They've come to these disciples and they've said, we've seen Jesus. Jesus himself told them, I will die and I will rise again. And they didn't believe. And finally, when there's a face-to-face between Jesus and his disciples, he rebukes them and he says, you are hard of heart. I told you what would happen. Others have told you I've been alive, and yet you doubted. You were hard of heart. It's the same idea he uses here. I told you, you have the law, but you're hard of heart. You didn't listen. You don't understand. There's a lack of perception. You don't get it. So, Jesus moves on. And at this point, Remember I said earlier in our talk that in this season of his ministry, Jesus is really focused on discipling and pouring into his followers, the people that are going to take his message and ministry forward. And so even though in this next sequence, he's responding to these Pharisees, it's almost like he's side-eyeing his disciples and saying, okay, guys, notice this. Here's what he says. Verse 6 through 9. But from the beginning, so he establishes a new authority. He's saying, back before Moses, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. He's quoting from Genesis 1:27, Genesis 2:24, going back to the very beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures. He's saying this was the intent for this marriage relationship. This is what God designed it for. It's almost like he's talking to his disciples here. His words are going to the question the Pharisees posed, but he's communicating to his followers, and he's saying this: do not be like these men who warp and bend God's commands to their own ends. Instead, this is what I want. In your fellowship of me and your discipleship to me, this is what I want. Determine to know God's will and follow it. Back to our big idea. The heart of discipleship is to walk in God's way as he designed, not as we desire. So you might be saying, okay, now that you've kind of dissected and diagrammed the passage, I understand kind of what I think Jesus is saying here, or what you think Jesus is saying here. What do we do with this? Where do we go with this? What's next? How do we put this into practice? Well, there's two important truths that we have to hold and carry with us as we move forward in following Jesus. The first is this: Jesus understands, and he is walking with me. Jesus understands, and he is walking with you. Here's what I mean by that. Some of you are sitting there and saying, man, this is hard, what Jesus is saying to his followers here. This is hard. This is a high standard. If Jesus is essentially saying, what I want as you follow me is that you put God's desires above your desires, that's difficult. That's hard. And I've got something either that I am going through right now, or maybe something on the horizon I'm aware of that's next for me in my life. And I don't know if it's possible for me to put God's design and his will above my desires. I don't know if I can do that. It's hard. Well, I understand. If you're in that camp, the disciples were right there with you. In verse 10, they got back to the house and they immediately started questioning, saying, Jesus, this is hard. In the parallel passage over in Matthew 19, they say, well, Jesus, if this is what marriage is like, maybe it's better just not to get married, because that is a high standard. Well, Jesus understands. He's walking with you. Consider this. Recall where we are in the life of Jesus. He is on his way to Jerusalem. He knows fully what is going to transpire when he gets there. And on this traveling, on this journey south, there's probably this growing anticipation and excitement within his disciples and followers because they can't wait to get to Jerusalem. Finally, the Messiah is going to be on full display for everyone, and they are all going to see, and they're all going to witness what we have seen for the past 3 years. Can you imagine? But mirroring their growing excitement was probably a growing dread in Jesus' heart. because he knew what lay ahead. He knew how hard, how lonely it would be. Finally, that comes out and that is verbalized in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's taken into custody. All this that he's been experiencing and feeling as he's been traveling comes out. And he says in Matthew 26, he fell on his face and said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you." Did you see it there? Father, if there is another way, would you open that door? But if there's not, I subject my will to yours. I subject my will to yours. Every single step along this journey was a choice, a conscious choice by Jesus to submit his will to the design and the desire of his Father, to lay aside his rights. Jesus knows and understands how difficult this can be for you. And when it gets hard, here's what you do. You fall back on and rely on what was written in Hebrews 4. There the author said, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize in our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, been tempted to pursue his own avenue, put his will first, rather than subject to the Father, to submit to the Father. He's been tempted as we are, yet without sin. He did it. And let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of Christ, to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need." He knows the difficulty of the way. He knows what he has called you to. He knows what he will lead you through, and he will walk with you on that journey. So truth number one, Jesus understands and he's walking with you. Okay? Now, truth number two. Some of you are saying, well, it's too late for me. It's not that I'm struggling with something that's currently going on in my life. It's not that there's something off in the future, but there's actually something in my past that I can't get over. And I don't think Jesus can get over it either. Maybe for you, I don't know. Maybe it is an issue of marriage and divorce. Maybe for you, you see the standard that Jesus sets in this passage and you say, well, I'm already in breach of that. There's no way back for me. Maybe it's not that. Maybe there's something else in your life that you said, Jesus can have everything, but he can't have this. He can't have this. Maybe it's a sin issue. Maybe it's a relationship issue. I don't know. But let me encourage you with this. Truth number two, Jesus will not leave you. Jesus will not leave you. Not only is he walking with you and he will be with you, and he knows what is going on in your life. He knows the high cost of discipleship, but he will never leave you. He will not leave you. Where do I get that? We go back to the design for marriage. The design that Jesus just set out in verses 6 through 9. Later on in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul is writing to this small church in Ephesus. And he too uses and recalls and references the design of marriage, God's design for that relationship. But in that passage, he parallels it with Christ's relationship to the church. And I'm going to read it now. It's kind of lengthy, so I don't have it up on the screen. I just want you to listen. And as you listen, watch for and note where Jesus is responding and leading and loving his church. Okay? Ephesians 5:25 through 32. Husbands, love your wives. And here's the model by which you should love her. As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ loves the church. Because we are members of his body. Therefore, and here he's quoting Genesis 2:24, the same passage that Jesus set out as the standard and the design for God's the marriage relationship. In his discussion with the Pharisees, he says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This idea of one flesh is initially you had two entities. Now they're joined, they're merged, and they can no longer be separated. They are no longer two separate entities. Now they are one. And Paul says, this mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. This refers to you and Jesus Christ. This was God's design, that when we come to faith in him, we now, like a husband and wife, are joined to Jesus Christ. By God's design. And that cannot be separated. It cannot be separated. So that's where truth number 2 comes from. He will never leave you. Jesus will not divorce you. So no matter what's in the rear view, no matter what you've done, no matter what you're dealing with, no matter what will come, Jesus will not ever, ever leave you, nor forsake you. It doesn't matter what the morality of your heart is like. It doesn't matter what the spirituality of your life is like. He will not leave you. So we're going to park it there this week. We'll pick up with the story of Jesus again next week. But remember our big idea. The heart of discipleship. What Jesus is looking to foster in those who follow him. What he's looking for in your life, if you've chosen to follow him, is this. He wants us to walk in God's way as he designed, not as we desire. As we do that, we must wrestle with that uncomfortable reality that on my own abilities, my desire falls short of God's design. But we can rely on these 2 awesome truths. Jesus understands, and he is walking with you. And whatever you're going through, whatever will come, he understands and he is walking with you. And he will never leave you. Father, thank you for these realities. Lord, I pray just as a people that we would be a people who understand the high calling of discipleship, who understand what it means to know and love and follow Jesus Christ, to put your design your will above our own. That as we do, Jesus, that we will find you consistently, time and time and time again, walking with us. And we will also prove that you will never leave us. You will never break that relationship. Jesus, thank you. I pray that we would rest in that. And I pray for these students as they get started with this semester. I know it's a crazy time. But Lord, I pray that they would make some wise decisions up front on how they spend their time and their energy, direct their relationships, such that this time on the university campus would be something that is truly transformative in their lives. In your sweet name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.